And dear colleagues, I am very pleased to open this conference, Governing Science and Technology, Governing Through Science and Technology, what was at stake for women from the late 19th to the early 21st century. I would like to say how important this conference today is for us. It is taking place exactly 2 years after the death of Larissa Zakharova. And Larissa was a great historian of the Soviet period, but above all, a great social scientist. She was an active member of our research center, the Center for Russian, Caucasian, and Central European Studies. And I think that this conference today is the best tribute we could pay her. I would therefore like to thank Grégory Dufaux and Isabelle Lemonon-Vaccin in particular for organizing this conference. Grégory Dufaux is assistant professor at Sciences Po Lyon. He is a specialist in the history of the Soviet Union. After working on nationalities, he has carried out research on psychiatry, medicine, and science. He is also interested in historiography and the epistemology of history. Isabelle Lemonon is a postdoctoral researcher who defended in 2019 a doctoral thesis on the history of women and the history of science during the French Enlightenment. She's a member of the Alexander Koyré Research Center and of the Research Center on Medicine, Health and Society. During the first part of this conference, I will chair the meeting, and we will have a general introduction by Grégory and Isabelle for about 20-25 minutes, yes? And then I will open the discussion. We will have about 10-15 minutes for the discussion. So thank you very much, Grégory and Isabelle, for the organization of this meeting today. And you have the floor for about 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Françoise.
Thank you.
I will start. The coincidence is an odd one, for without it ever having been discussed or decided, here we are all gathered together on the exact day that marks the second anniversary of Larissa's death. A coincidence indeed, but I could just as well have spoken of unforeseen circumstances and contingencies. Be that as it may, this coincidence, to finally call it that, is a matter of setbacks. The pandemic that forced us to postpone the conference in Moscow, and busy professional schedules that had to be reconciled. But that is the way in which things turned out. And it is with conflicting feelings that I'm now giving these words of introduction. My deep sadness and loss are mixed with my joy and relief at this meeting finally being able to take place, particularly as Donald Opitz and Brigitte van Tigelen have very kindly accepted to give the inaugural conference, for which I would like once again to express my deepest gratitude on behalf of us all. Coincidence, perhaps, but it is not all a matter of chance, even if the conference chosen focus undoubtedly corresponds to several contingencies. This choice springs above all from our work with Larissa as part of a 2-year group research project on governing science, governing through science, science and technology in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Within the framework of this research project, we organized 3 events during which the question of women, but also of couples, was addressed. And following the third of these events, we began with Larissa to consider the idea of a conference on women in Soviet science and technology. But her worsening health, unfortunately, prevented us from pursuing the matter. After Larissa's death, when I began to wonder what event might be held in her memory, it seemed obvious to return to the idea we had discussed. particularly as it was to some extent linked to some of her research. In her doctoral thesis, published 10 years ago, Larissa was interested in fashion during the Khrushchev thaw. Yet also the fashion she studied and wrote about was essentially feminine. She never shows a side of either the history of gender or of that of women. She certainly never set out to defy either. Her goal was simply to think to understand the political, economic, and social changes that began during the thaw. After this major work, Larissa began another equally ambitious work whose focus was now communications. Yet, whereas women were at the very heart of her thesis, they are now largely missing from this new book published the last year. To put it differently, they are present but play a secondary role. The engineers and leaders of the Ministry of Communications were men, and the women were the operators. This difference is, of course, not limited to the Soviet Union. In early 21st century America, for example, only a quarter of the workforce in the fields of science and technology are women, and barely a handful occupy senior positions. Yet, in the Soviet Union, this difference was rendered even more glaring by the fact that following the revolution, Bolshevik leaders not only immediately began to hail an equality between men and women, but also claimed science and technology as the very foundation of their effort to change the world. That women are a minority or are restricted to minor roles in the field of science and technology is a well-known fact, largely thanks to the first feminist works and the ones that followed, supported by numerous government agencies. For example, in the United States, the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Health. But the questions that it raises regarding the varied and cumulative mechanisms that determine women's career and their accession to leading roles in the government of science and technology have until now been insufficiently addressed by the social sciences. This does not mean, of course, that there are no studies on this topic, and there are important ones. Our intention is precisely to try to extend the studies that have already investigated the field. Hence, our certainty shared by all the colleagues of the scientific committee that this issue needed to be studied collectively, and studied collectively without limiting ourselves to a cultural area or a field of science and technology. This openness was to us the only way in which to analyze both the access of women to positions of responsibility within the field of science and technology, as well as the policies carried out to promote them in these areas.
To seek to analyze this cross-cutting movement in which women are both the subject and the object of the field of science and technology is to place oneself at the meeting point of two historiographies. The first of these is the history of women and gender that studies their place and the relationships of power within the field of science and technology. This historiography has shown that their presence in these fields was strengthened by the end of the 19th century, thanks to the opening up of secondary education to women and subsequently to the democratization of teaching after World War II. Although the presence of women increased, research in this field also revealed the fact that this increase was not the result of a continuous and inevitable process. Their access was difficult and by no means irreversible, and important forms of discrimination were maintained. This is what we saw earlier with engineers and operators with what Gregory said. That is that the naturalization of gender difference caused the feminization of certain fields to be accompanied by a subdivision that restricted women to trades considered less prestigious, thereby reinforcing male domination. The second historiography to which this event wishes to contribute deals with government of and by science and technology. Much research has revealed the transformation of modes of organization, of control, of management, and of administration of scientific and technological practices. Forms of knowledge were examined that inform ways of governing as well as ways in which public regulation is carried out through science and technology. For France, the historian of science, Jérôme Lamy, first considers that the end of the 19th century marks the emergence of a new regime of relationships between the states and science and technology. According to him, the biopolitics by which the states relied upon scientific data on populations in order to govern them rationally, later gave way to the archaeopolitics that emerged around the idea of public service and in which the role of science is to help the state to create norms. At the crossroads of these two historiographies, the study of women and gender relationships within the higher ranks of science and technology raises issues linked to relationships of power between men and women, to state policies and form of public intervention, to the scholarly construction of gender, and to the social and political effects of scientific and technical measures. How then can we account for the variety and specificities of these dynamic processes? By situated description from different disciplinary horizons, sociology, history, or political science, for the multiplication of points of view unquestionably present several heuristic advantages. Firstly, it makes it possible to apprehend objects without having to artificially sort them into different historiographical fields. They can therefore be considered for what they really are, without having to ignore any of their qualities or, on the contrary, to assign them new ones. Secondly, these descriptions steer away from the shoal of determinism by sparing us the risk of confusing the causes and the consequences. Similarly, they authorize us to see the reason for which actors do what they do, without having to attribute their action to a single reason. Lastly, these descriptions make it possible to identify the key moments and turning points by location, and therefore to reveal the variety of regimes of historicity according to location and geographical area. These various situated accounts therefore lead us towards a concerned and more complex analysis of the forms of logic specific to different actors, of their agency and means of empowerment, of the meanings attributed by protagonists to forms of scientific knowledge, and of the way in which their experiences are modified by scientific and technological measures.
The call for papers took place some time ago, but you may remember the lines of inquiry that we initially suggested. The four of them quite literally defined the perimeter of our investigation. The first of this line focuses upon women having reached position of authority. The inquiry does not merely focus upon the absence or presence of women, but also considers the work of scientific and technical institutions, including the nomination of their members. The task is to characterize the glass ceiling that female scientists and engineers encountered and to identify the historical and concrete forms it took. Work will also seek to understand the way in which women sought to go around the difficulties that some put in their way in the legitimate spaces of production and tuition of science and technology by involving themselves in other places. A second line of inquiry focuses upon the policies that female scientists and engineers carried out once they reached a position of authority. This requires us to consider at least two phenomena. The first relates to measures taken within scientific and technical institutions to improve the situation of women, whereas the second concerns problems privileged by women having attained position of responsibility. The aim is to see if they raised issues that men have neglected or ignored, and what measures they took to resolve or at least address these problems. A third line of inquiry aims to analyze how different protagonists resorted to science and technology to reduce gender inequality in society. The question here, however, relates rather to the way in which knowledge sometimes contradicted gender-based stereotypes and norms in order to understand how knowledge was used to carry out policies seeking to improve women's statutory recognition and or pay. By studying initiatives such as this, the goal is also to shed light upon connection between scientific knowledge, statutory recognition, and economic redistribution. When these initiatives coexisted with emancipatory measures aimed at other social groups, the way in which they may have intersected will need to be analyzed. A last line of inquiry concerns the way in which the success of women in science and technology is narrated. The goal here is to study not only how commentators describe and explain such success, but also how female scientists and engineers, having attained senior position, did so themselves. For it appears that the narration by men and women of these paths to success often refers to clearly gendered motifs, and these narratives influence gender-based prejudices and stereotypes by consolidating or, on the contrary, undermining them.
Within the perimeter defined by these lines of inquiry, as you already know, we have set up 7 panels that, as if through the rotation of a kaleidoscope, serve as so many prisms that enable us to see the elements of which our object is made up, how these elements evolve over time and according to place, and how they present themselves to the scrutiny of observers. Our goal is to grasp that which falls under permanence and change, identity and difference. Before we enumerate these panels, let us first express 2 regrets that might be addressed much further in July. We said earlier how much importance we attach to different cultural areas, but most of the papers concern Europe in its broadest sense and the Americas. This is, of course, disappointing, but it also says much about the degree to which these questions interest historiography from one place to another, and also the difficulties met in some locations to develop such research topics. Intersectionality should as much be part of our future discussion. And so here are the 7 panels. So women's trajectories, career storytelling, on the margins of science and technology, gendered professions, scientific collectives, science and technologies as ambivalent vector of women's emancipation, and new opportunities and resistance. These panels were conceived as spaces for research and discussion, so they are not fixed and will not necessarily determine the future publication. I would also like to remind the contributors that they are expected to submit a first version of their paper by the 30th of May when we will inform you of the names of the panel's moderators. These papers will, of course, be accessible to all the contributors. The panels will be held in parallel on the 1st and 2nd of July, according to the following schedule, as you can see on the table of this slide. All the panels will be recorded and the videos will be made available online. We hope that this group discussion and exchanges will serve as the first step of a long-term project that will notably lead to the publication of a book. So here are also a few dates and deadlines about this project, like the deadline first draft paper, May 30, the dates of the next symposium on July 1st and 2nd, the deadline for the final paper in October 1st, and by the end of March, you will, for the contributors, will receive the guidelines for to write their paper, which will be peer-reviewed later. And last but by no means least, permit me to thank on behalf of us all, that is the scientific committee, Alain Blum, Patrice Brett, Valérie Burgos-Blondel, Françoise Dossé, Grégory Dufault, Liliane Hilaire-Perez, and myself. So let us thank the following institutions for the support they have given this project. The Center Alexandre Coiré, the Franco-Russian Study Center, the Center for Russian, Caucasian, and Central European Studies, the Center for Research on Medicine, Science, Health, Mental Health, and Society, the Slavic History Research Center, the Deutsches Historisches Institut, I'm sorry for my German, the EHESS, or School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, the Rhône-Alpes Historical Research Laboratory, and the Women's Commission of the Division of History of Science and Technology of the International Union of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Isabelle and Grégory, for this introduction, which is a great teaser before the conference, which will take place in the beginning of July. We now have about 10-15 minutes for questions. If some of you have some questions, you can open your microphone or you can ask your questions through the chat, as you prefer. Is there a first comment or first questions? Okay, Judith, yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. And sorry, because my question is a very basic question. I'm not sure I got the information about the paper we have to send on the 30th of May. Is that a paper which is going to be circulated between us? Or is it a paper, is it a written paper, or is it some draft paper for an oral presentation? So what sort of paper are you expecting for this? And my question also is, are we going to receive all the papers of our panel before the panel or not? Voilà. It's just a different way of writing it, that's all. Thank you very much.
Do you want to answer, Isabelle or Grégory?
I can answer. It will be a work paper. And this paper will be circulated between all the members of the panel, and not only if someone of another panel want to read it and to, of course, participate to the discussion, it will be better. But our idea is to create a space of discussion, of exchange, and it's why all the paper will be available, work paper, to improve this paper, and in October to have a real solid, good paper.
Okay, thank you very much. And first, thank you very much for organizing this, even if it's, of course, disappointing not being in Moscow, but it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you to participate.
Is there any other?
You can use also the and in,
Okay.
We have the possibility. I don't know how it is in English, but in French it's a reaction.
Maybe I have myself a question about social sciences, because you speak about science and technology, but what about the specific question of women in social sciences, and how will this question be addressed during the conference, or is it maybe not really in the topic of the conference? I wanted to come back to this question of social sciences.
This is for you, Isabelle.
I mean, it will, of course, be part of it, because that the main focus will be on women the main focus is governing science and technology, and where are women in all of this, and how gender is a part of this governance, and how it influences it. So it's not exactly women in science and technology or women in social sciences, but how the science and technology are objects and subjects of governance, and how elements of gender influence is acting on it. So for me, there will be women in social sciences, but it's not exactly the angle.
Thank you, Isabelle. There are other questions in the chat about the papers. And
yes, I see the length of the paper. It's around 6,000, 7,000 words. We are still discussing with editors, so that's around that, maybe a little less, but we prefer to ask a little more because it's easier to shorten.
Because the idea is if we have a paper that are a little bigger, we can ask you to cut and going straight to the point, because we want we don't want a collection of paper. We want a book, a crammed book, but we want each paper with some strong perspective. So it, if we tell you a little bit more than it will be needed, I think it's a good way to also to work.